Welcome to the Southern New South Wales Aged Care Regional Forum. My name is Christine Rackar, Sector Support and Development Officer at Community Industry Group. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. I would also like to extend that respect to Aboriginal people at this webinar today. Erin Nichols, also a Sector Support and Development Officer at CIG, will be monitoring the Q&A, and Tessa Parsons, Policy and Project Officer at CIG, will be assisting with the IT. All attendees will be emailed a copy of all PowerPoint presentations and videos used in the forum. A recording of this forum will be on the Community Industry Group website within a couple of days. It's disappointing that Rosemary Jers from the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission was unable to present today. However, she did send through some information. So they do say they have the resources on their website, the Aged Care Quality website, and a dedicated CERS inquiry line and an inbox for questions. The Commissioner is hosting a series of webinars for which providers can register if you go onto their website. And also all providers will receive an email in the near future which contains a link to a CERS starter pack designed to contain all the information providers will require to ready themselves for CERS in-home services. So I would now like to introduce Paul Sadler from Paul Sadler Consultancy, who will provide an update on the Aged Care Forum reforms. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much, Christine, and it's a pleasure to be back with the Illawarra Shoalhaven Forum. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and acknowledge their ownership of the lands on which we're meeting today. Next slide. So what I'm going to do for you today is really go through three main areas. The first is talking about the Department of Health and Aged Care's recent in-home aged care discussion paper and the sector's response to that. Second is looking at the recent federal budget initiatives. And thirdly, just a very quick update on what else is happening in terms of aged care reform at the moment. So we go to the next slide. So the Department of Health and Aged Care, just about a fortnight ago now, released its latest in-home aged care discussion paper, to give it the title that it used. Interestingly, the paper itself doesn't use the term support at home, which made a few people think, oh, does this mean that the new program might not end up being called the Support at Home program? However, the budget papers still refer to the new program as Support at Home. So I don't think there's been any formal decision by government to rename the program, although that's not impossible given that the title is kind of linked with the previous government. So it may be that the ALP wishes to distance itself to some extent from that term. This is a slide that the Department of Health and Aged Care has been using when it's been giving presentations about the new paper. And each of the slides that follow are taken really from the discussion paper. So I've not really added anything to them, though I'll make some comments on the content as we go through. This is the department summary, therefore, of what it's doing. A new program now to commence on the 1st of July 2024. It's been pushed back a year by Annika Wells, the Minister for Aged Care. The discussion paper identifies a model for this new in-home aged care program that improves access to services, better aligns services to needs, reduces administrative costs, makes or provides better support for independence, aims to make aged care simpler and to facilitate innovation and investment. The new program has a similar scope to that which has been announced now for more than a year. So it will be bringing together CHSP, home care packages, short-term restorative care and residential respite referrals into a single new in-home aged care program, or as we're probably still calling it, the support at home program. Next slide. This is the overview from the department's discussion paper of how its proposed model will operate. Now, I will do my best to explain this, possibly not quite as well as the department would itself, but I'll give it a go. So first of all, the consumer or prospective consumer is assessed by an assessment team, either at home or in hospital. The assessor and the client or their carers set up an initial support plan. And the idea at the moment is that that will come with a quarterly budget that is identified for the service mix that the support plan identifies. In the first instance, the assessment might trigger one or both of the following. Firstly, short-term support for independence. This is really the restorative reablement arm of the new program. It would include access to goods, equipment, assistive technology, including an intention to have a loan scheme. There would be access to home modifications, short-term allied health support, and where needed, specialised support services. If the person either immediately or following a short-term restorative intervention needs ongoing supports at home, there will be a capacity for the consumer to have one provider or multiple providers. There would be flexibility within the quarterly budget to adjust services. There would be a clinical care partner or case manager identified where that is necessary. There would be a capacity to access extra services for temporary needs. Client contributions would be set by capacity to pay, and there would be access both for the consumer and for the service providers to regular reports on services and the budget. From the point of view of what it will look like for providers, there will be this short-term support for independence funding stream. For goods, equipment and assistive technology and home mods, this will be separate funding from the rest of the program. As I mentioned, it will include a capacity for an equipment loan scheme to be in place. And the intention is that there would be national procurement capacity available to this scheme so that it would maximise the buying power of the goods, equipment, technology and home mod services. There would be a grant program in place for specialised support services. Now, the specialised support services are that which exist already within CHSP. The government has been undertaking consultations with the specialist support providers. So these are people like continence, dementia, other specialist services that provide support to people with particular needs. There would also be short-term funding for allied health and restorative care, and this obviously would incorporate the current short-term restorative care program. There would then be what the department is describing as a mixed funding model for the ongoing support services. This would largely be based on activity-based funding that would be targeted to individuals based on their assessed needs. The department is describing then supplementary grants that would be available for particular service types, ex-CHSP, that have been identified as needing access to basically a base level of service funding. These would include transport, cottage and centre-based respite, meals and social support group. There would also be supplementary grants available for providers that operate in thin or niche markets. So the thin markets could be rural and remote services. The niche markets might be where you're servicing, for example, culturally, linguistically diverse or homeless services, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander services. As well as this base model of a mix of activity-based individual funding and grant funding, there would then be a funding pool set at 25% of the client's budgets each quarter that could be accessed where a consumer needs additional services for a short time. As mentioned, client contributions will be set by capacity to pay. The government is indicating at the moment that they're intending payments to be monthly or possibly even more frequently, dependent on the finalisation of a payment at point of service delivery platform, which was what was flagged in their paper back in January. Next slide. So the department's own paper identifies 5 key areas of focus for further consultation with the sector, and I'm going to step through each of these. The first is self-management of services, how that will operate, particularly in a multi-provider environment. The second is how care management or care partners will operate. The third is exactly how the funding model will operate. Fourth is how you get flexibility for changing needs. And fifth is how you stimulate innovation in the system. Next slide. So for self-management of services, as I mentioned, the department's intention is that there would be a support plan that lists monthly services to which the consumer is entitled and a quarterly budget allocation. So you can see here in the example from the department's discussion paper that the quarterly budget is expressed in dollar terms, which is a change from what they were talking about back in their January paper. The services you're entitled to per month would be identified based on a type of service output entitlement. So this is similar to what the department talked about in its January paper. So in the example here, this consumer's got a quarterly budget of $2,000. They're assessed for transport, domestic assistance and meals, and there's a per month allocation expressed in output terms for each of those. Now, the consumer can choose multiple providers. So it could look at these 3 service types and say, I want to use the community transport provider, a domestic assistance provider locally, and access Meals on Wheels. However, they could also go to a current home care package style provider that bundles all of these up together and say, I want you as a single provider to provide this service. Unlike the department's original propositions, you might remember in the January paper, they talked about different service groupings that you would be allowed a degree of flexibility between them, but you couldn't move between completely different types of services. Well, this time round, the government is giving much more flexibility and is proposing that with some limits, which I'll talk about shortly, there would be a capacity to adjust services within the monthly budget. So you could take your quarterly budget in this example of $2,000 and you could, instead of using all of the transport services, you might increase the number of meals that you use. Or you could actually get a service type that you haven't been identified at all, as long as it stays within the budget allocation. There would be an online expenditure tracking capacity and a calculator so that both service providers and consumers can identify how they will operate. So as the title of this slide suggests, the government is intending that there be a capacity for consumers to fully self-manage. So similar to the arrangements within the home care packages at the moment. Some of the discussions, and we'll pick this up a bit more on the next slide, is obviously what would the role of a care partner or care manager be in this context? A particular challenge will be how is the coordination and information sharing occurring across providers. Now, this is not a new issue for those of you running CHSP services at the moment, because of course, if consumers are accessing more than one CHSP service, this issue of coordination and information sharing across the providers is still a relevant challenge. So while it's, potentially you could look at this and say, oh, the department's missed this really important step, I'm not sure that it's any more complex in reality than the current system is. It will be really important that providers get paid properly and the reporting frequency works properly. I think when the department put out its paper in January, this was one of the areas of real concern. Would a payment platform really work properly? Now the department's bought itself an extra 12 months to get all those technical questions right, but they're still going to be really important questions for providers. And finally, what are the risks and consequences? Say you are self-managing as a consumer and you book too many services within the quarter. What happens? How would the service providers get paid if there's an overbooking that's occurred? What does it mean for the consumer and for the providers? So the department doesn't have fixed answers to those questions yet, so they'll be looking for our feedback in the consultations over the coming months. Next slide. So the government has been using, at the suggestion of groups that it consulted with around the role of care management earlier in the year, they're exploring use of the term care partner for the role of a care manager in the future. There's an intention in this new supported home model that there would be two types of engagement that care management would focus on. The first would be where you need a care partner for ongoing monitoring of services for people with complex needs. The second is the bit that got taken out of CHSP some years back, but evidently needs to be put back in for people with less complex needs. And that's the ability to engage episodic care management support where it's necessary. So it's encouraging that the department has picked particularly that second aspect up. Now, the care partner role would include clinical oversight and monitoring. Now, that's similar to the requirements currently on home care packages, but it will again up the ante for ensuring that the mix of case manager skills that organisations have include clinical care knowledge. Secondly, clearly there will be a role in coordination of services or supporting the coordination for people who are self-managing. And thirdly, providing a check-in on client safety and well-being. That will still be a requirement even if people are self-managing. So some of the discussion topics here: how will care management operate for people with multiple providers? So remember that the consumers on the previous slide can choose who their providers are. So who would be responsible and accountable for the care management role and for the accountability for the client outcomes in those circumstances? There will need to be role clarity around the care manager or care partner role. And there will need to be an articulation about how this role intersects with care standards. Next slide. So in terms of how the funding model is going to operate, I mentioned earlier that there will be a separate goods equipment assistive technology and home modification scheme put in place. It will include a loan scheme and also national procurement capacity. There has been some relatively encouraging consultations with the GEAT and home modification sector about how such a scheme may operate. But again, we're waiting to see some detail, which is not in this discussion paper at this stage, about how this new scheme will operate in detail. The department has indicated there'll be grant funding for the specialised support services, and there's been negotiations and discussions with that sector underway. The Department has indicated there will be activity-based payments for ongoing services for the individual components, but they don't have a lot of detail in the discussion paper about how the activity-based payments process will operate. And there is an expectation that there will be further consultation with the sector around that. As I mentioned earlier, the supplementary grants, they've identified the ex-CHSP services where the feedback they've received over the last 8 or so months has indicated there really needs to be additional funding support. And it's worth noting that they're pretty much the same list that the Royal Commission identified as needing to be grant funded. So that's transport, meals, group social support, cottage and centre-based respite. And obviously the thin and niche markets that I talked about earlier. There's the 25% flexible pool and the consumer contributions. So the topics that the department's keen to get our feedback on are how should the eligibility for the grants component operate? How would that be administered? Activity-based payments assume that there will be a level of unit pricing put in place. How exactly will that operate? And the big bit that there's been no consultation about because there was an election happening is the whole issue of consumer contributions. So that now becomes a live issue, which we do anticipate seeing the government actually address more directly in consultations in coming months. Next slide. So in terms of how flexibility might operate, this is where the government is putting a little bit of caveat around how the flexibility within your funding allocation might operate. So there will be flexibility to change services within that quarterly budget, as I mentioned, but there are 2 limitations on that the government's flagged. The first is if you're assessed for a certain level of care management as an ongoing component of your service delivery, you can't reduce that care management component and substitute it with another type of service. Secondly, the government is intending to put in place caps on monthly cleaning and gardening levels. Now, we don't know again exactly how those caps will operate. Will they be decided at the point of the assessment, or is there some standard approach to eligibility for cleaning and gardening that the government will put in place? We don't know that yet. A second component that will limit flexibility is there's no accumulation of funds between quarters. So if you've got your allocation of $2,000, but you don't fully spend it within that quarter, it lapses, unlike home care packages at the moment, where any unspent funds roll over and you continue to have access to them until you leave the home care package environment. That's not the intention of the government here. Instead of that, there'll be this 25% flexible pool for providers to make temporary service increases. So some of the discussions that the government would like to hear from us on is 25% sufficient for a flexibility pool? What guidance will be needed so services know how to access it? And how will the system track changes between the budgets and the entitlements across multiple providers in real time? Next slide. So one of the big questions for the government is how will innovation operate in this new model? So the new model, by potentially the government setting the prices, setting through the assessment process, the types of services and a budget that you're entitled to, with a quarterly allocation that lapses at the end of the quarter, is there's not going to be a lot of extra money available in the system for providers or indeed consumers to innovate. So how will providers be encouraged to do things differently and better? Well, the government is flagging that maybe that's through home care star ratings and quality indicators, so transparency about quality performance. Will the fact that there'll be some guaranteed funding through grants components add greater certainty and potentially the growth of the program in the future, actually support innovation through additional investment. The government's noted that there could be some ways to adjust the funding model to support pooled services in congregate settings. Now, I'm not entirely clear what they think a congregate setting is in community care. I assume they mean a retirement village or something similar, but do they also mean a small rural town, for example? So is there some capacity on a smaller geographic basis to treat services in some pooled arrangement? And certainly the government's flagging that maybe on top of all of the above, there might need to be some innovation grants that are made available from time to time. So the discussion topics here is, how do we as a sector think that the government should foster innovation? What are the congregate settings and what sort of pooled funding might help in those environments? How much will competition on quality drive innovation? And what do we think about innovation grants as an idea? Next slide. So what has the sector response to date been? And in particular, what has the Support at Home Alliance position been on some of the changes that the government's looking to put through? Next slide. So the Support at Home Alliance brings together a range of New South Wales, other state and national organisations that represent older people, service providers, local governments, and other groups. We've had assistance from the Australian Health Services Research Institute at University of Wollongong in the development of an activity-based funding model for home care. Next slide. Back in December last year, this initial paper titled Seamless Aged Care, How to Set Up Support at Home Right First Time was published. And by now, many of you have probably seen that paper. It's been based on engagement with members of the Alliance partners who provide both home care package services and CHSP. And we did that work to contribute to the development of the Support at Home program. The Alliance is continuing work on policy development and advocacy and is continuing to work with the University of Wollongong. So as well as the work for this initial paper, the university not that long ago completed proof of concept research on activity-based funding's application in community transport, and is now working with Meals on Wheels New South Wales and Meals on Wheels services around Australia on extension of the concept into the meals delivery and preparation area. Next slide. So the key themes that the Support at Home Alliance has been advocating for since late last year have firstly been that we should be looking, as we create the Support at Home program, to align the funding model with that which is being introduced through the Australian National Aged Care Classification in residential aged care. And the argument the Alliance has put forward is that would facilitate seamless integration of services across the full range of aged care. The proposed model is activity-based, with a mix of a base care tariff that would ensure capacity to provide services and an individual care payment that would be based on care delivered or the activity actually provided. Not dissimilar to the government's proposals, the assessments for this Support at Home program would be calibrated to the level of need, but the difference is that we've been recommending they're aligned with ANAC classifications so that you do allow that seamless integration. The activity-based funding component would determine the allocation to a funding class, and services could then be variable within the funding allocation. Now, interestingly, that is now the proposal that the government has adopted. It wasn't clear in their January paper that they would go that route, but they are now much more aligned with our recommendation there. From the point of view of the Supported Home Alliance, care management could be integrated within the funding model either via the base care tariff or the case mix component. The base care tariff, which would support the capacity of services, could be paid at different levels according to the real costs incurred. So, for example, if you're in a regional area and your cost of service delivery is higher than a metropolitan area, your base care tariff could be adjusted to reflect a higher payment. Next slide. As well as the work that the Supported Home Alliance has been doing, there's been two other important inputs into the future of the Supported Home program that have happened in the last 2 months. So the National Aged Care Alliance wrote to Annika Wells in September and outlined 17 propositions where consumers, providers, unions and professional groups agree on the shape of supported home. Now, some of those have been picked up in the department's paper, and many of them reflect the sorts of positions that the Supported Home Alliance has also been advocating for. Interestingly, the National Aged Care Alliance didn't reach consensus on a particular funding model. So while there are 17 propositions, there's not a detailed proposition from NACA on exactly how the funding model should operate. The University of Technology Sydney's Ageing Research Collaborative also recently published a paper on its views on the design of the Supported Home program. And on a later slide, which, as Christine mentioned, you'll get a copy of these presentation slides, there's a link to the UTS paper. So the Supported Home Alliance is preparing a submission on the department's in-home care discussion paper. This submission is due on the 25th of November. I'll be interested to hear your comments and thoughts on the discussion paper and the propositions that the Supported Home Alliance has been putting forward when we come to discussion shortly. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, my second main area to address today is just to give you a bit of an update on the October budget aged care initiatives. Next slide. So the biggest single component of the federal budget was around residential aged care. And while it's not the primary focus of most of you online today, though it would be for some of your organisations, I think it's important just to talk a little bit about what is happening in residential care, because it always has a flow-on impact through the rest of the aged care system. So firstly, fulfilling an ALP commitment in the election campaign. There's $2.5 billion over 4 years to require all aged care services to have a registered nurse on site 24/7 and to increase care minutes. So care minutes in aged care are already intended to go up from the 1st of October 2023 to 200 minutes per resident per day as an average. They're now intended to go to 215 from the 1st of October 2024. There is some additional funding that the government has allocated to a transition fund as the AN-ACC is introduced, and this is to ensure that no services have an actual reduction in overall funding levels as AN-ACC replaces the former aged care funding instrument ACFI. Importantly, there's nearly $850 million to support COVID pandemic-related costs and protection initiatives across aged care. Next slide. In home care, there is no additional funding this year for further home care packages or CHSP services above previous growth targets. So for many years now, there have been additional home care packages in particular, and on some instances, additional CHSP growth announced in various budgets over the years. But this time round, nothing new from that point of view. However, there are still 40,000 additional home care packages being rolled out from previous budget commitments this financial year. There is confirmation that CHSP will be extended for a further 12 months to reflect the new start date for support at home. There's $23 million in the budget to support the next steps in implementing the Support at Home program. These include a large-scale trial of an integrated assessment tool, the establishment of a service list advisory body, and commissioning the Independent Hospital and Aged Care Pricing Authority to undertake a pricing study. Budget paper number 2 confirms a commitment to introduce caps on home care fees, which was part of legislation that passed Parliament in late October. We still don't know precisely how this is intended to be implemented, and we're waiting further details from DOHAC on that. As part of the power that was in the legislation, the government can now cap charges home care providers pass on to care recipients, and it will shortly be removing exit fees entirely. Next slide. Obviously, one of the really big challenges for all providers in the last few years has been workforce, particularly through the pandemic. So there were a number of initiatives in the budget. The first was the government did put some money into its contingency reserve for the outcomes of the Fair Work Commission Aged Care Work Value Case. Now, last Friday, the Fair Work Commission announced a 15% interim pay rise for direct care workers, including in home care. There's going to be further discussions with the government, unions and the employer bodies, including ACPA, about how that interim pay rise will flow through to the system. Christine told me you should have all received a survey from the department to CHSP service providers asking for information about your staff mix so that they can identify what proportion of staff fit the criteria of a direct care worker from the Fair Work Commission interim decision. There are additional university places in nursing and fee-free TAFE and vocational education places, including in aged care. There's additional funding for the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, including an expansion of an aged care skills pilot program. There's an expansion of paid parental leave and changes to childcare arrangements, all of which will hopefully assist in attraction and retention of aged care workers. Next slide. In terms of the governance of the aged care system, it's worth noting that budget paper number 2 does make reference to an ALP commitment, which follows recommendations from the Royal Commission, that there should be a duty of care legislatively introduced and civil and criminal penalties for breaching that duty of care. But we await further details as consultation happens around a new Aged Care Act. There is some additional funding to support transition of older Australians older Australians with a disability out of aged care, and additional support for infrastructure and services for First Nation peoples, people with from diverse communities and in regional Australia. There is a pretty sizable sum of $312.6 million for additional aged care information and communication technologies, including streamlined reporting and support for technology to help aged care sector reform. We don't know how much of that will be spent internally by government, e.g. on the My Aged Care, and how much will flow through to providers. There is additional funding to expand the regional stewardship of the aged care outreach model. This is the one where the department is placing staff into PHNs, its own staff. I know that is a model that's already in place in the Illawarra. And finally, there's some funding to establish a Office of an Inspector General of Aged Care and also a Commissioner for Complaints within the Complaints Commission. Christine, I just picked up that I doubled up on that last point. I'll edit it and send it through to you for the circulation later. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to finish off now by just talking fairly briefly about some of the other reforms that are underway affecting home care and home support. Next slide. So first of all, part of the legislation that passed Parliament a couple of months back is there is now a code of conduct for approved providers, governance people, for approved providers and their aged care workers. This is starting up on the 1st of December. There's information available on the Quality Commission website, and also there is a draft of the Code of Conduct and the legislation to support that that's now available. The Serious Incident Response Scheme, Christine mentioned this right up front. Unfortunately, the Quality and Safety Commission couldn't join you today, but there are online sessions in the next couple of weeks about CIRS in home care. So I'd encourage you to get all the information you can about that. Again, the Quality and Safety Commission has information up on its website. There are new governance requirements that start on the 1st of December. Around the membership of governing bodies, establishing of advisory bodies. There's a requirement for a clinical care advisory committee and a requirement to ask consumers whether they want to have some sort of consultation advisory group for consumer input. And there's also new reporting requirements for residential aged care and home care package services. Note that these new governance requirements don't apply for CHSP only services at this point in time. And if you're an existing organisation, some of the deadlines are actually a year away. They're actually December next year where they become mandatory. And that's to allow time for general meetings and other processes to take place, because potentially you might need changes to your constitution, for example, to nominate the types of people who can go on to the board and the establishment of new advisory bodies. There is legislation that's passed now to enable greater information sharing across government agencies in aged care, veterans affairs and disability, and also additional requirements for transparency of information captured on aged care services. And I mentioned the Independent Health and Aged Care Pricing Authority. So that organisation has now had its remit expanded to include advice on aged care pricing. It'll be doing its first costing work for residential care by the middle of next year. And as we've seen, the government has also funded it to provide advice on the establishment of the new supported home pricing model. I think that's my last slide. So the next slide just gives you all the resources and links to the various things that we've just been talking about. And we go to the final slide. There's some information just about how you contact me if you need to at any point in time. Christine, I'm happy to kind of hand back and see if there's any questions or discussion people would like to have for the next 15 minutes or so.
Thanks, Paul. That was really informative. There is so much happening. So as far as I can see, we haven't got any questions in there at the moment. I don't know if people are overwhelmed or on top of it, but yeah, there's a lot happening. But Erin's now going to put up a quick poll. So if everyone could complete that poll, that will be great. Thanks. And I'll double check again if there's any questions. No. All right. So Paul, I want to just ask, so staffing levels, when clients are able to go with many service providers, is this going to be an issue that, how do they manage how many staff they need? I just find it's already hard for them to do all their rosters. And then if clients are moving around, you know, is this going to be an issue for providers?
Well, I think it'll potentially be an issue for providers, consumers, and for the workforce. So first thing to say is, let's not overcomplicate the model and how it might work and make it appear worse than the current system, because it potentially isn't when it comes to workforce issues. We currently have staff that work across sometimes multiple different service providers. How you roster those is already a challenge. We currently have consumers who self-manage. Now, they're sometimes using platforms like Mable or others to manage their workforce. So yeah, they're having assistance either through a platform or some other mechanism to manage the rostering of staff. There's nothing in the government's proposals that would stop any of that happening in the future. So I think that where the additional complication comes is what's the payment mechanism. So at the moment, for our home care package, the provider gets the money and then allocates it to who the consumer asks to be paid effectively, where self-management is occurring. And obviously, if you have a multitasked worker in a home care package who might be providing personal care, domestic assistance, assisting with respite, etc., then you're paying the one person and the organisation employs that one person. If you go to a multi-provider model, assuming you're not fully self-managing, my guess is that from the provider's end and the employment contract end, it wouldn't look very different from the arrangements that organisations currently have.
Thanks, Paul. And the other, I heard that the grants are going to be quite competitive, and I don't know if that's for the thin markets and so forth, because, you know, it's always been an issue with the smaller service providers is filling out the grant forms and so forth, and, you know, the right wording. So
yeah, and look, we've really got no idea how the grants process might operate. So it's very high level, the description the government had both in its January paper and now again in this one. They have undertaken that they will have further consultations with the sector around the details of the funding model. And that will be really important for us all to get an understanding of that. At the moment, if you're CHSP funded, you're kind of funded in perpetuity, even though your agreement might only be for a 1 year or 2 or 3 year period. And there will be a level of negotiation around the outputs in your activity work plan. It's kind of ongoing, really. I've got no idea whether that's the intention here or whether the government would want, for example, to go through some sort of tender process to assign who gets access to these grants in the first instance. So we don't have any indication about that at this point in time.
Thanks, Paul. Erin, have we got some questions in the Q&A?
We've had a few questions come through. So the first one is about self-managed packages, and it's a compliance question. So do compliance requirements still stay with the provider? So for this, i.e. subcontractors and clinical governance and oversight.
So the short answer is no, compared to the current system. The more complex answer is the department doesn't quite know what to do instead.
Okay.
And they're asking us for our feedback on that. So as described in the discussion paper, and this is similar to what they described back in January as well, is that if you self-manage, you can choose your providers. So you don't have to have your package funding, or in this case, your quarterly budget funding, funneled through one organisation to you. So if you're self-managed, as I described earlier, you could choose Meals on Wheels, community transport, and, you know, a current domestic assistance provider for those 3 services. each of those services would then be separately funded on an activity basis. So as you provide the meals, provide the hours of care, the trips, you would claim as the provider from the government. So that means the consumer doesn't need to directly manage payments to anybody. The government still manages that. But it also means that it's not clear where the accountability lies for the overall case management component. I think the government's intention is that even if you decide to self-manage, there would still be somebody assigned with an overview of a check-in and an ability to provide help to you. Whether that in turn means that a compliance requirement then assigns to that particular care partner organisation, I don't know yet. And that's one of the questions the department's asking us.
Thank you. So the next one's from Andrea, asking about increasing respite beds and if there's any funding to increase this program now, or is it based on the mix of base care tariff and activity from July 2024?
Now, Andrea, I'm assuming you're talking about residential care respite beds rather than cottage respite here. So I'm going to answer in terms of residential care respite. If I've got that wrong and you meant cottage respite, just pop something in the Q&A or the chat. In terms of residential care respite, there's no major change in the funding model for residential care respite at the moment. So there's still a payment that is made based on whether you have somebody assigned as a high level or a lower level respite resident. And that system is running alongside the now AN-ACC classifications. So no major difference. Therefore, there's not either been any particular announced increase in the availability of respite beds.
Thank you. Andrea responded, she was asking about both, but yeah.
With cottage respite, the former government did announce in its budget response to the initial findings of the Royal Commission that there would be an additional CHSP respite funding round at some point. Now, to my knowledge, that's not happened yet, even though it was in a budget now 18 months ago. So I'm assuming that at some point we will see some additional funding rolled out for respite services through CHSP. And that will obviously then in turn roll into the new supported home program base once that funding is allocated out. Some of that may target cottage respite, but it wasn't clear in the budget announcement how much, if any, it would target cottage respite versus flexible or other respite forms.
Great, thank you. A comment and a concern from Pauline, and I think it's a really fair one. Pauline works for a home modification standalone service in Central West New South Wales. She's got concerns about not being able to compete against the larger companies in terms of buying power and what that's going to mean for clients that are local to her area.
Pauline, really relevant question. I mentioned earlier in response to Christine's question that we don't know precisely what mechanism the government is going to use to transfer from the existing CHSP funds that are block funded, grant funded, into the new model in July 2024. So, for example, if you're the home mods provider in the Central West, will you have to compete against other organisations for grant funding or indeed overall service delivery within the region? Or will the government still ring fence support on a region by region basis for particularly the grant component? The fact that we don't know that means I don't know the extent to which you will have a direct competitor or competitors for home modifications in the Central West. My suspicion is that at least to get a transition process done, it won't be in the government's interest to go through a full tender process right across the whole of Australia for every different service type. I think that's a pretty unlikely outcome because A, it'll be politically fraught for them to do that. And middle of 2024, you'll be getting relatively close to another federal election. But secondly, their concern is also about continuity of service for existing consumers. So I think on that basis, it's unlikely they'd go, big explosive tender everything out. But we don't know for sure what grounds they're going to use yet. So I think the answer is watch this space. Tell people what you need us to be advocating for you around this and how to best protect service delivery in your area.
Thank you. So we have a question around self-managing and whether or not participants will be able to pay for services provided by family or friends through that process.
So at the moment, under home care package arrangements, you cannot engage directly family and pay them. And you're probably fairly limited on a friends basis too. Although having said that, if people went via a platform like Mabel or something, then maybe you could engage somebody via a kind of third-party arrangement. There's nothing that I've seen from the government, either in the discussion paper or in any of its consultations that it's held to date, where it's flagged any intention to change that so that family members in particular could be paid for care. I don't think that's on their agenda.
Okay, thank you. There's a few more. I'm going to try and get through as many as I can. Chris, you just have to tell me when I need to stop. So where consumers have a higher need of emotional support rather than a physical need, and this is a question from Barbara, people who need a chat or need someone to be able to talk to about things that are worrying them, will there still be, I suppose, a central location with a staff person where that client can build a relationship? Obviously, this is something that's been important during floods and COVID.
Yeah. I think all service providers have probably learnt about the importance of providing this through the various emergency situations and the pandemic. I think one of the lenses we need to look at the government's proposals through is the extent to which they actually support that or make it more difficult to do it. They have picked up the importance of care partners, care managers in the system, and that's encouraging. And obviously, where somebody has a care partner, care manager in place, they will be the logical person for someone to go to. For each individual service provider, they're also going to have to work out with the lessons you've learned from floods and fires and COVID, how you will support your consumers. And there's nothing in the funding model, particularly if there is a grant component to it, that means that there's no capacity to do that, or the government is trying to stop us offering that level of support to consumers. But as activity-based funding is introduced more fully into the system, then obviously for many consumers, that will be the primary way that providers get paid. And then the question is, will the pricing that the government assigns to the payments of activity actually allow enough margin in order to provide this sort of support?
Fantastic. And the last two questions, there's a bit of a theme going on, I hope. So I'm going to combine them and hope that helps expedite things a little bit. So the first of the last two was around, will providers be required to register for a service like gardening or cleaning, or will consumers submit those invoices directly? And does this mean that it would open up to sole traders to register for aged care? And the second question was around, is there an indication of the process that will be required for providers to become approved aged care providers? Will there be opportunity for single service providers with capacity to provide other service types?
Now, I didn't go into this in detail in my presentation, but alongside the government's discussion paper on in-home care, they also fairly recently released a second discussion consultation paper on regulatory reform. And in that regulatory reform paper, they are flagging the potential for a registration component, which would basically allow sole traders potentially to register, similar to the NDIS. And for service providers that haven't, traditionally been CHSP single service entities to potentially expand their service offerings. So I think the answer to both those questions is that it is likely there will be some changes that will facilitate more people and more types of services being involved. Having said that, though, many people, including members of the Supported Home Alliance, are pretty concerned about heading in the NDIS direction here. The registration process for the NDIS has not necessarily proved to be a wonderful success. It's questionable whether we want to open up the aged care system in quite that way. I see somebody's just posted, can we talk about what the link to that regulatory reform paper is? I'll actually add it in, Christine, to the resources section at the end of the presentation. I'll email it back to you shortly.
Excellent.
And that's all the questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Erin. And thank you so much, Paul. That was so informative, as always. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
So now I'd like to introduce Halima Simpson from Wollongong City Council, who will present the Old Boys Social Club project. Thanks, Halima.
Thanks, Christine. Hi, everyone. I'd just like to say that I'm coming to you from Dharawal country, so I pay my respects as well to the elders and to any Aboriginal people here with us today. So I'm just going to share with you a much shorter presentation. It's a bit of an experiment Wollongong Council took this year to look at why older men aren't participating in some of the services and programs we've provided. And it came from some research that was done the year before I started in this area at council, looking at really high rates of suicide among older men and what was going on there. Now, council, we're not a suicide prevention service, so I took that report and looked at ways to increase social connection opportunities, because social isolation is the key non-clinical risk factor for suicidal ideation. So I thought council was a great place to look at ways to investigate what we're doing to appeal to a broader range of people, including older men. And so this photo I put on the front of the presentation because it shows a few things. There's a couple of guys there from council, guy in the middle and the guy on the right. And we reached out to guys across council in bush care, in the libraries, in the marketing team, wherever we could find them, wherever we could drag them into our den in community development to help us start the process of engaging with older men and to give us some ideas about what to do. And it was absolutely critical that we brought them in early, because they sort of changed the course of we were going to do some focus groups with older men and find some men in council to run those focus groups with older men. But our colleagues said, don't do that. Just put on stuff, a range of stuff that guys like to do, and they'll come and we'll have a chat while we're doing the thing that we want to do. And so I just thought I'd show you that photo, because we were constantly getting told that men don't join things, men aren't interested in coming, they don't participate, we try and they never come. And that's a really good photo showing that actually they do, and it was great. And the support of our male colleagues was really crucial. Next slide, please. So why do we do this? So as I said before, the stats aren't great for men, and that goes for health. Lots of health stats say this, and that includes mental health. And older men particularly, they're less likely to ask for help or to reach out certainly for social help or health issues that may come with a stigma like loneliness. So that's why we took we looked at research about ways to increase participation by men in health programs, and there's a really important slide I'll show you later about men's health initiatives, and that's the kind of thing, that's the approach we took. So social connection, as I said before, that's what council, we have a lot to offer. We've got amazing people across from our guys that work out in the parks to the guys in engineers, all sorts of guys across council and all the places that we have. And I was trying to think of another word that started with P, so I just put services in there because humour's a big part of this project too. So I just left that in there. And we had a look at what was working at council and seeing why it was working. And we were told that bush care is very popular. Men like to have a purpose and have a job, and that includes bus driving for our community transport group and running the barbecue. They may not want to come and socialise, but if you say, well, can you come and do a job, they'll go, oh, okay, and then they'll come for that some men. And I guess a critical thing is when I looked around the community development team and some of the services areas in council, they're pretty much women wall to wall. So we naturally we don't have that lens, so that sort of unconscious bias things going on. So it's really important to sort of actually ask the question, why aren't men coming? What are we doing? How can we do things differently? It's nothing about men, it's about what we're doing. We looked at how to market to men and what men are interested in. And obviously there's many different types of man. And so we needed to offer a range of things that might interest them and so they could take something up. And I just thought I'd mention this was all done at the tail end of the COVID lockdown, and then which at that time we were trying to organise events that were outside and airy and lots of fresh air, but then the rain hit, so it was quite challenging, but we gave it our best shot, and it was a chance to reset. I think COVID has obviously affected lots of service providers and people. Connections have been lost, workers have left, and so there was a whole mix going on, as we all know. Next slide, please. So this was a project about any older man. It wasn't just necessarily about men who were using social support. It was about people who are self-funded retirees. It was about men who are maybe in their 50s and don't qualify for certain things. We just wanted to open it up. We didn't want to have any restrictions on what we were doing, and just to see what came up. And so we went out to a lot of organisations and just asked them about how many men use their services. And interestingly, some of them didn't know or hadn't really thought about it when I asked, and they had to go away and do a bit of a look in their Excel spreadsheets and come back and go, oh, okay, yeah, okay, not that many. So it possibly was an unseen issue, or I had other people tell me, oh, there are just less older men, which is true slightly, but not to the extent of the participation rates for men is a lot lower than can be seen. That you can't just say it's because there are fewer of them. And when we asked older men, or what we discovered during this project that I'll show you about in a sec, is what appeals. And a lot of men just say they want a reason. They're not just going to come out. A reason, having a coffee and a chat and meeting people is definitely not a reason for a lot of men to come out. To leave the comfort of home and to the stress of transport and trying something new. Also, it had to be a casual vibe, so not formal. They didn't want to feel like they were in a classroom. And it had to be active. So without messaging, it was a call to action, not an offer of help kind of thing. Trusted provider, a regular time so they could remember when it might be on. A couple of men said we don't like a nursing home vibe. If they see that, they just leave quietly. And humour was a really big thing. Everyone was talking about that a lot. And the men at council that I worked with were just constantly joking around. And I realised, I'm going to embrace this. This is actually use this power for the good, rather than things were derailed, but in a good way. And it made a lot of sense at the end. We learned how to reach older men. A lot of older men, I'm sure there are many older men out there who are totally across the internet, using their phones and their smart devices, but a lot of older men don't. And we don't seem to, in the Illawarra anymore, have weekly free newspaper. So information that perhaps was being distributed that way until quite recently is no longer available to them. And so everything's online. And that has just basically it means a lot of people miss out on what's going on. So we went to some male designers at council to design a knockout poster. We targeted the messaging to men, and we used all the networks we had, including targeting messages to families. So people who do use social media, like daughters, sons, that kind of thing. And we looked at barriers and enablers for participation. So that, you know, all the things you can see there, all the attitude sort of bureaucratic hurdles. So we looked at My Aged Care. When you are registering for My Aged Care, there's a process there. And when we looked at how men ask for help, that some of the ways that they are being, what they're required to do in order to get My Aged Care in itself can be a barrier. Transport was a big issue, and a lot of men who no longer have a license, it impacted their lives greatly. And some of them were very proud, didn't want to ask for transport. Others who were able to, through our program, say that they're entitled to it, and it actually led to more independence and that kind of thing. And men led the process the whole way. So that was a really important thing too. Next slide, please. So this is what I was talking about before. This is from the Australian Men's Health Forum, and it's about male-friendly services. So they've done all the research, and everything that they say here is pretty much what we found as well. It was about using a strength-based approach. It was having the culture of seeing men not as a problem, but as you know, a partner to ensure that they participate. All those things there. You target them directly, you meet them where they are, use male-friendly language, which in our case we found was really about humour, a dry sense of humour, not bureaucratic language. And let men lead the process. I won't read all those things out, but that was a really key thing. That was how we started the process. We looked at that and thought, okay, that sounds like a good place to start. Next slide, please. So this is the first poster we came up with. There was this group at council that I met with, these guys. They were some of the funniest conversations I've ever had, and it was a bit of anarchy, I would say, in the group. But they very much reshaped the project from having focus groups to having activities, and many activities were suggested, including microbrewing sessions and jamming sessions, which all sounded great. But these are the 4 ones we came up with for the initial project. And we want, as I said before, we wanted to take out any barriers to men participating. So we said, you know, who's it for? Well, it's for the mature older man, and we'll take your word for it. So there was no sort of age cutoff or anything like that. It was just open to anyone who the poster appealed to. And the other thing, you can't really see it on that, but with transport, again, we had language like just give us a call if you need help getting there on your own, getting to the venue on your own. Well, we've got you covered, kind of thing. So it wasn't, we just left it open, so there was no sort of stigma about certain people being eligible for transport and others not. So that was the cool poster that was created by a guy here at council who's really amazing. Next slide, please. So as I said before, a lot of men, we asked men when they did come to the program how they heard about it. I would say maybe one found out about it on the website. Everybody else heard about it through other ways, through friends, through posters. One of my colleagues suggested we partner with Meals on Wheels, who were graciously delivered these flyers to men who were receiving meals. And I could talk about the guy in the middle, that's Ron, and he became a community champion for the project. He got that. He said he was about to chuck out the flyer because he doesn't really like flyers, but he saw it and just sort of hit home that this is what he wanted to do. And then he got in touch and started to demand more flyers be printed, and then basically spent weeks handing them out and talking to people at bus stops to join up, because at the time it was really hard to get men to sign up to anything really. And the guy on the right who's fixing the bike on the right hand side, he was the guy that came to the program through Ron, as Ron talked to him at the bus stop and said, hey mate, look, here's a flyer, you've got to come to one of these. So that's how it happened. So it was about getting physical copies of flyers in the face of men where they are. Next slide, please. Yep, that's another photo to say, just going to where men are. So we went out to the Coniston Men's Shed and talked to them, and and all sorts of places. Wherever we could find men, we would go. That was just that one. Next slide, please. So this is the first event we did. It was in Thirroul earlier in the year, and it was the smallest one. It was the first one, and I think there was still a lot of hesitation around COVID. And so it was a game of pool and a classic flick, The Hustler, with Paul Newman. And so it was non-stop talking throughout that film. It was, everybody was just raving about the fashions and the style of the time, and no one was really listening. But that was the first tentative steps for our project. And some of the guys needed community transport to arrive, and they hadn't used that service before, so we were able to get them registered and tee them up. Others maybe weren't eligible for community transport, so we were able to use funding for the transport disadvantaged as they didn't have their own transport, and others made their own way there. And one guy, we just basically corralled him when he saw him at the library, and he came in that way. I won't talk too much about it. It was a great learning thing, and a lot of people from different, there was a guy there who hadn't left his home for about 3 or 4 months, and there was another guy there who was recently an ex-surgeon who'd had some health issues, so had recently retired, and he was being taught how to play pool by one of the other guys. But it was great. Next slide, please. This is the Old Blokes and Spokes one. So we had a facilitator come in and fix up some bikes at the library, and they were donated to Bundalia and by Bernardo's for kids. And so we didn't lose. So we had some people who we didn't scare off from the first event come to the second one, and each time we saw them, they seemed to get their health just seemed to improve, and their physical ability seemed to improve, and they kind of got more engaged. And that's a picture on the right of someone doing something naughty, riding a bike in the library, that was part of the vibe. It's all about having fun, so I kept that in there. Next slide. Bushwhacking and barbecuing. So that's Greg Fickers, our amazing bushcare guy at council, who can talk to anybody about anything at any time. And that was the great thing. We have these people at council who are just gold, and he's been a really active participant in supporting the program. And we went to Pucky's estate in Wollongong and had a wonderful time. And I'd say about half the participants were maybe like in their early 60s, late 50s, and they were the ones doing the weeding, and the older guys said, forget it, if we get down, we won't come up again. So, but they did other things like put the barbecue together for us, had a job. And again, a lot of these guys hadn't been at a social thing for many months since COVID, and in fact some had lost their wives, and it was a really great day to get out there and do something. Next slide, please. And this was the last one for the first series of events we did. It was we partnered with Fishcare, which is a state government organisation that they run their own volunteer program to show people how to fish, and they provided all the bait, all the gear, and they came. We met down at Lake Illawarra and had a fantastic day just knocking around. And this is Derek, who I wanted to show you, whose daughter found out about it, and he came out, and he'd been, yes, very isolated during COVID, and it was a wonderful day. That's Greg again. We couldn't keep him away. He's from Bushcare, and he was helping out on the day. Next slide, please. And there's some more photos of the day, and a lot of guys from cold communities enjoyed that one. They love fishing. They were experts, and it was interesting for the Fishcare volunteers, some of whom later came to some of our events, saying it was great to see how experienced some of these fishermen were. And so it was a different kind of project that they were working on. Usually they would sort of teach kids what to do, but this way around they were sort of, teaching each other, which was even better. Next slide, please. So those were the 4 main first events that we held. And I should have said the Old Boys Social Club, it was named by the guys that we work with at council, and all the events, all those funny names were also named by the guys at council. So Ron, our community champion, as soon as we started the project, he said, well, where's it going to go? Is this a pilot that's going to lead nowhere, or what's going to happen next? So he was amazing, and he suggested the next phase of the project, which has been embedded at Wollongong Library, at a couple of libraries now, Wollongong and Warrawong. And he could see at the pool session, around the pool table, when people were doing stuff or watching a game, that's when people would talk to each other. And he thought, we need a hook to get a men's sort of thing going, and it needs to be cards or games or cribbage, which he used to play as a kid and he loved playing. And so he helped us set up a couple of these weekly free drop-in sessions at Wollongong and Warrawong, with tea, coffee, biscuits, and then just play some of their favourites. And it was very important about where it was in. He sussed out the whole, first of all, in Wollongong Library, where to be, and it was up the front near the window, so that other men could see what was going on. It'd be less intimidating for them to come and join the group. And also he wanted it to be on at the same time as the Knit, Stitch and Yarn ladies, which have been going for years, and why did they have something and they didn't? And also, you know, he really enjoyed the fact that there were the kids going on. It just felt like they were part of the community. That intergenerational thing was so important. And that group is going strong, where I don't really have much to do with that. They sort of manage themselves. The library sort of has taken that on, which is brilliant. And there were 10 down there last week doing their thing. Next slide, please. So those are the flyers for those mornings. So the one in the middle, that's a recent translation into Macedonian for the Warrawong service. I thought I'd put those in. Next slide, please. This is, I'm not sure if this is going to work. This is the YouTube video. Yeah, here we go.
We've called ourselves the Old Boys Social Group, but it's open to mature age gentlemen, so we can form hopefully friendships out of this and fill in a couple of hours of our lonely time. We started with a day where we played pool in the morning, watched a movie in the afternoon with a lot of talk in between and during. Then we went fishing out at Lake Illawarra. And again, I saw exactly the same thing. Everybody enjoyed what we were doing, even though we didn't catch any fish. They were all enjoying what they were doing. But again, the conversation was the important part. I've come connected with the library, trying to start a men's social group for older men, so we can get together every Wednesday and have a chat, and also play games, pass a bit of time.
It started with our staff at council wanting to do something for the blokes in the community. The main thing is the social side, and just to relax and have a bit of fun. I know that when I retire, I want to have a place to go like this.
Majority of them are probably like me. They've lost their partner, and that means you're very lonely. So anybody that's out there wants company, every Wednesday morning, 10 o'clock, we'll see you here.
Next slide, please. That was Ron. So as well as the games mornings, we had some grant funding left over from a project that didn't quite get off the ground earlier in the year because of COVID. And we were able to use that for a few more activities that a colleague of mine ran in the middle of the year. And with each new tour, more and more men have been booking in. So that was the Botanic Garden Buggy Tour. The most popular one was the Port Kembla Port Tour, so the working port tour that an organisation runs. And there was a Shell Harbour Mariner Tour as well, you can see there. So whenever we got extra funding, we would put on some more things. Next slide, please. And so now we've got some more grant funding, and we're currently running 6 tours. And the ideas for the tours came from the men themselves, and they just wanted to know how stuff works. I asked them if they wanted to go to see a show or something. They said, no, not really, but we'd love to, have a look behind the stage and underneath the stage and see how that all works. So then I reached out to different organisations, and we've got a program called Behind the Scenes on Thursdays. Next slide, please. And that's the poster, how things work. And that was us at the Illawarra Performing Arts Centre, and that's James at the front who gave us a backstage tour of all the scenery and all the lighting and the orchestra pit. And people were looking at cogs and wheels for ages, and we had coffee. It was great. And next slide, please. And I just thought I'd show a couple. The amount of time we spent on this, that pulley system, that's what makes the curtains open and close and go up and down. There's a counterweight system, and we looked at that for a long time, and it was fascinating. And everybody was talking. And all of the activities are fully booked. We've had to close the wait list. So we know men do want to do things. You make it irresistible and they will come, and we just have to work with them and get them to lead the process. So that's then is that my last slide? That was just the web page that we have now at council, and it's got the games mornings there all the time, and then as we do tours or events, we put them up there as well. And those are the next ones coming up that are all fully booked. But yeah, we had a lot of interest from different aged care organisations as well about what we're doing. So it's been really good just to see that conversation happening. That's me, Christine, unless there's any questions.
Thank you, Halima. That's a fantastic initiative, and especially to get older men out, it's so difficult.
Yes.
And, you know, the higher rate of suicide in older men, that I think it's fantastic, and hopefully we can get that spread to other communities as well. Erin, are there any questions? No, I don't think so.
Oh, sorry, no, there we go. I was on mute. We've just had one come through from Esther about whether or not people need social support codes to participate.
No, not in these ones, Erin. No, we've left it open for anyone. And if people need help with transport or something like that, sometimes we hook them up through My Aged Care to get community transport to get to events. But basically, we're trying to keep it as open as possible, and we don't have any funding restrictions in what we're doing, which has been really great. We can just welcome anybody, basically. And that actually we've had men in their 40s come to some of the games mornings, but that's been really lovely for the older guys. And what's been happening is I just sort of, you know, when I'm walking through and say hi and bye, you know, they'll have conversations around health, or they'll be counselling each other. They've got their own thing going on. So we really didn't want to marginalize people or to make men feel like they're in a certain cohort. So there's people of different ages, different social backgrounds, different, you know, so, and that's actually, I think, strengthened the project.
Great. Thanks so much, Helena. That was fantastic. So now Narelle Williams from Shellharbour City Council has asked me to inform you of the Healthy End of Life project, which is called HELP. Shellharbour Council entered into a 6-month partnership with La Trobe University and Palliative Care New South Wales on a project that was funded by Coordinaire Primary Health Network to explore council's role in end of life. The project was finalised in July this year, and one of the highlights of the project was the production of 4 videos that were local residents to tell their stories about their experiences with end of life, death and dying, and how these experiences have enriched and added the way that they view and live life. So the videos were launched in August as a Dying to Know You Day initiative, and they are available from the council's website, Healthy Ageing Shellharbour Council. So now we'll show you 2 of those videos. And so if you'd like to go ahead, thanks, Lisa.
And the death cafes we've run have been absolutely amazing. People have come along and shared beautiful discussions and experiences with us. It's incredibly important to be able to talk about death. Death is a natural part of life, but for so many reasons we find excuses or reasons to not go there.
The Healthy End of Life project is about council exploring its role in the end of life space.
It's given community members, if they wish, the opportunity to come into that space and work with Narelle and I around having those discussions and exploring, finding out information and finding out choices that people have so that they have a healthy end of life, so that they're learning how to ask for help from other people in a way that they want their needs met. My father was a very proud man. He was given a life-limiting diagnosis. Very difficult to have those conversations with him. When my father died in hospital, not having had any discussions with us about what he wanted for my mum's care, for what he wanted for his funeral plans after he had died, I was left with a mum who was very confused, and I became her carer. I guess my hope for people would be that they don't travel that road alone. They engage with their family, they engage with their friends or their carers and talk about what your wishes are so that everyone is really clear about what it is that you want, so they can really support you well. Family want the best for you. They want to know what you want.
Constantly subject to change, far beyond these words.
I wanted to care for my great-grandmother because it was something that was part of everyday life growing up. My mum was one of Nan and Granddad's carers, so that relationship was just really natural and normal. There was just this connection and this thing that happened between the different generations, that it was just part of what happened between all of us. And then at that point where she was actually dying, we were in the nursing home with her for a week. So I was able to bring her music and bring things that meant a lot to her, like coffee and cake and photos, and help her maintain connections to things that were important to her. And we stayed in the nursing home and massaged her hands and played her music and yeah, really supported her through that process. And it was a really beautiful thing to be part of. So as she was losing her memory, she really held on to me because I brought her back to the things that really meant a lot to her. Like, I was in the middle of HSC trials at the time, and the school said, "Oh, when will you be back?" And I had to go, I don't know how to answer that question, but being here and now is so much more important to me. The advice I'd give to people going through the process of watching an older person sort of lose their ability and coming closer to the end is to be present. By me being there with her and just talking to her, it meant a lot. When you have that connection with someone and you're able to spend that time, and you can walk away feeling really good about you've done everything you can for them. And I feel like it's poised me to be more resilient and understanding that first experience really shapes how I'm able to participate in conversations like these and support other people. I think it's important to talk about death. It can be hard and scary, but it's also really natural. And it won't happen more if you talk about it.
Okay, so our last video today is the Illawarra Shoalhaven hold a monthly 1-hour RAS CHSP meeting where we discuss what service providers have available for that month. And then we discuss any issues or information in relation to services. So one of the issues was incorrect referrals for home maintenance under the CHSP program. And from this discussion, a short video was developed to identify what is and what is not provided under the CHSP maintenance program. It's a great resource for new RAS and for CHSP providers. So we'll actually attach this recording to the email that we send out to you. And if you'd like to have a look, it's only a 2-3 minute video.
There's sometimes a bit of confusion about what home maintenance services can be provided under the Commonwealth Home Support Program, CHSP. And this video is just to provide some clarity about what's important to consider when applying for services under this program. The main principle of home maintenance services is to ensure the safety of the client. That is, services that will assist the client to maintain their independence and safety within their home environment. A referral for home maintenance can only include repairs that mitigate or remove identified risks to the client's health and safety. A referral cannot be for something that is just cosmetic. It needs to relate to the safety of the client. Lawn mowing is always a sought-after service, which is not always available. When services are available, it is short-term only. The client could have had an operation or fall or deteriorated and is unable to mow their lawns. This service would be provided in a time-limited way, just until the client is well enough to return to mowing their lawns. Or if they are unable to mow their lawns, then it would be expected that a private contractor would take on the job paid for by the client. Every decision to provide services must have the safety aspect needs demonstrated. Here are a few examples. Yard maintenance. This could be a one-off cleanup directly relating to ensuring client safety, rather than maintaining a garden's visual appeal or aesthetic value. This can only be conducted a maximum twice a year. Water blasting of pathways and driveways if they are slippery or grimy and pose a slip risk can be included, but not just if the desire is to make them look good. Gutter cleaning and gutter guard can be done for the whole house, but gutter repairs can only be done for sections of gutter that are above any entrance or access area. We may be able to provide general plumbing style repairs related to the safety of the client, but not repairs of appliances like dishwashers and washing machines. In terms of general electrical style repairs, we can do smoke alarms, but we would not repair air conditioning units or appliances like stoves and ovens, etc. In terms of roof repairs, urgent severe weather damage needs to go through the SES. Non-urgent storm damage needs to go through home insurance. If the client doesn't have home insurance, an assessment by scope will be conducted and recommendations made. Mould removal and locksmith services are also available, as these are two areas that could pose a risk to the client's health and safety. Indoor maintenance could be general repairs, mesh replacement and sliding door rollers, reattachment of tiles internal and external, general carpentry repairs, repair or replace timber boards and fascia boards, repair drawers, cupboards, wardrobes, doors and hinges, but only if it relates to client safety. Services could also include relaying pavers to prevent tripping hazards and window repairs. We may be able to repair front fences and gates once again for the safety and security of the client. Other services which may be able to be provided include hanging lower rods in wardrobes, repairing door handles, repairing doorbells, installing key lock boxes, installing or repairing handheld showers, light bulb changes, and repairing loose rails. For more details, please refer to the Commonwealth Home Support Program Manual.
So that's the forum for today. A recording of this forum will be on the Community Industry Group's website, and all the PowerPoints and videos will be emailed to all attendees. So thank you to all the presenters, to Tessa and Erin for their assistance, and to all participants for attending. Thank you. Bye. You can do that.